"Security will escort you out," he said, casually swiping on his tablet like he was ordering lunch. He held out his hand for my heavy titanium key fob, calling it redundant hardware. He thought he was just firing an expensive manager to save the quarterly budget. He didn't realize he was actually pulling the safety pin on a $50 million grenade. You see, that key didn't just open doors. It was the only digital heartbeat telling the facility's life support system not to seal the exits and freeze everyone inside to preserve the inventory. Before I explain how I turned his termination letter into a $5 million consulting check, quick question: where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. And if you've ever had a boss who cut corners until they cut themselves, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss how cold this gets. My name is Kaylin, and for the last 8 years, I have served as the Director of Biologistics and Safety Operations for a facility that sits like a concrete fortress on the rainy outskirts of Seattle. To the casual observer driving past on the interstate, our building is nothing more than a gray, windowless monolith humming quietly in the fog, but inside, it houses nearly $50 million worth of experimental pharmaceuticals and temperature-sensitive vaccines. My role was never about innovation or marketing. It was about permanence. I was the person who ensured that, when the power grid fluctuated during a winter storm, the backup generators kicked in within 3 milliseconds. I was the one who calibrated the pressure sensors on the airlocks every Tuesday morning at 4 a.m., while the rest of the executive team was asleep. To the new board of directors, I was a line item on a budget spreadsheet that looked uncomfortably large. But to the facility itself, I was the autonomic nervous system. I knew the rhythm of the compressors, the specific vibration of the blast doors, and the exact weight of the responsibility I carried. That weight became literal on a Tuesday morning in November when I was summoned to the office of Julian Price. Price was our new chief financial officer, a man in his early 30s who had been brought in from a failed tech startup with a mandate to disrupt legacy costs. He wore suits that were too tight and spoke in buzzwords that meant nothing in the world of heavy industrial refrigeration. His office was a glass box situated on the mezzanine level, overlooking the main logistics floor, artificially heated to a tropical temperature that stood in sharp contrast to the precise, clinical cold of the warehouse below. When I entered, Price didn't offer me a seat. He didn't even acknowledge the 7 years of perfect safety audits filed under my name. He remained focused on his tablet, his finger scrolling through a list of personnel with the detachment of someone ordering dinner. "We are moving towards a decentralized safety model," Price said, finally breaking the silence without lifting his eyes. His voice was flat, devoid of any human inflection, the voice of a man who viewed employees as hardware to be swapped out. "The board feels that a dedicated director of safety is an antiquated concept in the age of AI-driven monitoring. We're automating your department, Kaylin. As of this moment, your role is redundant." I stood there, feeling the hum of the building through the soles of my shoes. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. In my line of work, panic is a liability, and emotion is a failure of protocol. I simply watched him. I watched the way he sat comfortably in his ergonomic chair, completely unaware that the air he was breathing was being cycled and purified by a system I had redesigned 2 years ago. He extended a hand, palm up, expecting compliance. "We'll need the physical token," he said, sounding bored. "The bio key. Legal says it's proprietary hardware." I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and withdrew the device. It wasn't a sleek plastic badge or a digital smart card. It was a heavy, industrial-grade authentication token, encased in titanium and rubber, roughly the size of a smartphone but 3 times as heavy. It was scarred from use, a tangible piece of the building's security architecture. I held it for a moment, feeling the cold metal against my skin. This key was not just an access pass, it was a dead man's switch. It communicated with the central server every 15 minutes to confirm that a qualified human officer was on-site and active. If that signal vanished, the building was programmed to assume the worst. I placed the token on his glass desk. It didn't make a light tapping sound. It landed with a heavy, dull thud that vibrated through the furniture. Clunk. The sound seemed to hang in the air, final and ominous. "Be careful with that," I said, my voice steady and low. It needs to be docked in the safety console within the hour. If the battery dies, or if it leaves the geo-fenced perimeter, the system interprets it as a security breach. Price finally looked up, a smirk playing on his lips. He picked up the heavy key, weighing it in his hand mockingly before sliding it across the desk toward the young man standing in the corner. "I think we can handle a battery charger, Kalen. You're not the only one who knows how to plug things in. Trent here will be handling the transition." I turned my gaze to Trent. He was Price's protege, a digital optimization lead who looked like he had barely graduated from college. Trent grabbed the bio key and, instead of placing it in the dedicated charging dock that sat clearly labeled on the desk, he shoved it into the pocket of his designer jeans. He treated the heartbeat of a $50 million facility like it was a set of car keys. He grinned at me, an expression of unearned confidence. "Don't worry," Trent said, patting his pocket. "We're going to migrate this whole system to the cloud by Friday anyway. No more clunky hardware." I didn't correct him. I didn't explain that you cannot upload a liquid nitrogen failsafe to the cloud. I simply nodded, turned on my heel, and walked out of the glass office. As I descended the stairs to the main lobby, the familiar sounds of the facility seemed to whisper a goodbye. The hiss of the pneumatic tubes, the low drone of the servers, the distant beep of forklifts. It was a symphony I had conducted for years, and now I was leaving the orchestra without a conductor. At the security checkpoint, O'Malley was waiting. He was the head of physical security, a man with gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He had seen me enter Price's office, and he had seen me leave without my badge. He didn't ask questions. He knew the look of a termination. As I passed his desk, he leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "They didn't ask for the override codes, did they?" O'Malley asked, his eyes darting up to the glass office where Price was now laughing at something on his screen. "No, O'Malley," I replied softly, pausing just for a second. "They didn't ask for the codes. They didn't ask for the manual. They just asked for the key." O'Malley looked at me, then at the heavy steel shutters that lined the exterior windows. A look of understanding passed between us, a silent acknowledgement of the storm that was coming. "I'll keep the radio on the emergency channel," he said, "just in case." "You do that," I said. "And O'Malley? Put on your winter coat." I walked out through the double glass doors and into the gray drizzle of the parking lot. The moment I crossed the property line, the invisible tether was severed. The clock had started. My bio key, now sitting in Trent's pocket, was no longer transmitting the authorization signal to the central server. The system would give a grace period, a standard delay to account for bathroom breaks or signal interference, but the countdown had begun. I didn't get in my car. Instead, I crossed the street to a small diner that faced the facility. I ordered a black coffee and sat by the window, watching. Inside the facility, the first changes would be subtle, almost imperceptible to the untrained executives. The artificial intelligence governing the building was designed with one primary directive: asset preservation. If the human safeguard is missing, the system assumes a catastrophic event, a kidnapping, a biological leak, or a terrorist attack. Its logic is cold and binary. If no human is verified to monitor the temperature, the system must freeze everything to ensure the product survives, regardless of the comfort of the occupants. 20 minutes passed. From my vantage point across the street, I saw the first sign. The ambient lighting around the facility's entrance flickered. The welcoming soft white LEDs shifted, pulsing once, then turning a deep, solid amber. It was the visual code for standby mode. Inside, the HVAC system would be diverting power. The warm air being pumped into Price's glass office was now being cut off, the heat exchangers reversing flow to prioritize the cooling units in the warehouse. I imagined the scene inside. Price was likely adjusting his tie, feeling a sudden chill draft across his neck. He would stand up, annoyed, and walk to the thermostat on the wall. He would tap it, expecting an instant response, but the digital display would be dark. He wouldn't understand that the thermostat had been locked out by a higher priority protocol. He would blame the building's age. He would blame the maintenance staff. He would scream at Trent to fix the AC, not realizing that the air conditioning wasn't broken. It was working perfectly, just not for him. 40 minutes passed. The rain outside picked up, blurring the view, but I could still see the silhouette of the building. Suddenly, the massive exhaust fans on the roof, which usually spun with a lazy rhythm, roared to life with a mechanical shriek that I could hear even through the diner's glass. They were purging the air. The system was creating a negative pressure environment, sealing the interior to prevent any potential biological contaminants from escaping. This was the containment phase. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from O'Malley, just a picture. It was a photo of the main security console. The screen was flashing red with bold white text. Biological integrity, risk detected. Initiating deep freeze. I took a sip of my coffee. It was hot, a stark contrast to what was happening across the street. By now, the temperature in the executive wing would be dropping rapidly. Without the biokey docked in the safety station, the system viewed the executive suite as a non-critical zone and was actively sucking the heat out of it to reinforce the thermal buffer around the vaults. Price and Trent were now trapped in a glass box that was rapidly becoming a refrigerator. I saw movement in the second-floor window. Trent was running toward the glass door that separated the offices from the hallway. He grabbed the handle and pulled. Nothing happened. He pulled again, harder, putting his foot against the frame. The magnetic locks had engaged. Those doors were rated to withstand an explosion. A 20-year-old in skinny jeans wasn't going to budge them. I saw Price join him, slamming his hand against the glass, his face twisted in a shout that no one could hear. They were shouting at the administrative assistants on the other side, but the staff was backing away, looking at the flashing red strobes that had just activated in the ceiling. Then came the final escalation of the first hour. The blast shutters. These were heavy, corrugated steel curtains designed to seal the building in the event of a civil disturbance or a hurricane. Slowly, mechanically, they began to descend over the exterior windows. I watched as the shutter above Price's office lowered, inch by agonizing inch. I could see Price staring out, his eyes locking onto the diner across the street. He saw me. I raised my coffee cup in a subtle, silent toast. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I just let him see that I was warm, and he was not. The shutter slammed down with a final clang, cutting off his view of the world. The building was now a sealed tomb. My phone rang. It wasn't O'Malley this time. It was a blocked number, but I knew who it was. The automated alert system would have bypassed the local branch and gone straight to the corporate legal department in Chicago. They were seeing the data logs. They were seeing the unauthorized termination of the safety officer, followed immediately by a level 5 lockdown. I let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. I wasn't an employee anymore. I was an outside observer. The phone stopped, then rang again immediately. I picked it up on the 4th ring, keeping my voice calm, professional, and utterly unconcerned. "This is Kaylin," I said. "Miss Kaylin, this is Robert Sterling, General Counsel." A voice barked on the other end, breathless and panicked. "We have a critical situation at the Seattle site. The system has locked down. We have executives trapped inside, and the fire department is refusing to breach the doors because the external displays are warning of a biohazard. We need your override codes immediately." "Mr. Sterling," I replied, checking my watch. "I believe you have been misinformed. I was terminated exactly 1 hour and 14 minutes ago. My security clearance has been revoked. I am currently a civilian sitting in a diner. Providing you with override codes would be a violation of federal cybersecurity laws, as I am no longer an authorized user." "Damn it, Kaylin!" Sterling shouted, his composure fracturing. "This isn't a game. Price is texting me that it's 40 degrees in there and dropping. The air is getting thin. He says the system is sucking the oxygen out." "That's the nitrogen purge," I explained matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "Standard protocol for fire prevention in a secure vault. If the system thinks there's a threat, it displaces oxygen with nitrogen to prevent combustion. It's excellent for the vaccines. Less ideal for humans." "How do we stop it?" Sterling pleaded. "Tell me how to stop it." "I can't tell you, Robert," I said, "because I don't work for you. And frankly, the manual override requires a physical biometric scan from the safety director. Since you fired the safety director, the system is doing exactly what it was programmed to do, protecting the assets from incompetent interference." There was silence on the line. He knew I was right. He knew they had triggered this themselves. However, I continued, my voice smooth. I am available for freelance consultation. But I must warn you, my rates for emergency crisis remediation are significantly different from my previous hourly wage. Name your price, Sterling said instantly. Just get over there and open the doors. I'll email you a contract, I said. It's a standard independent contractor agreement. The fee is structured as a percentage of the assets I am saving. $5 million. Wired immediately. $5 million? You're insane! The inventory is worth $50 million, Robert. And Price's life? Well, I assume you have an insurance policy on him, but the PR fallout of a CFO freezing to death in his own office would cost you double that in stock value by tomorrow morning. You have 10 minutes before the nitrogen levels induce unconsciousness. Check your inbox. I hung up the phone. I didn't rush. I opened my laptop, attached the pre-prepared PDF, and hit send. Then I looked out the window at the steel-gray fortress. The flashing amber lights reflected in the puddles on the street, blinking like a heartbeat. The building knew what it was doing. It was waiting for its master to return. And for the first time in 7 years, I wasn't just the person who kept the cold out. I was the one deciding when to let the warmth back in. The screen of my laptop glowed with a harsh, artificial luminescence against the dim, rain-streaked atmosphere of the diner, displaying the outgoing email that contained the most expensive consulting agreement I had ever drafted. Across the table, the steam had long since stopped rising from my coffee cup, leaving a dark, stagnant ring on the ceramic, but I had no intention of ordering a refill or checking the time on my wrist. In the high-stakes world of corporate brinkmanship, patience is not merely a virtue, it is a weapon, and right now, I was wielding it with surgical precision. Inside that sealed concrete fortress across the street, time was behaving differently than it was out here. For Price and Trent, minutes were stretching into agonizing hours as the nitrogen purge reached its peak concentration, displacing the oxygen in the executive suite and turning their glass-walled office into a hypoxic chamber. I sat there, listening to the relentless drumming of the Seattle rain against the windowpane, imagining the chaos unfolding in Chicago as Robert Sterling likely screamed at a terrified finance director to bypass the dual signature protocols that usually governed such massive wire transfers. He wasn't just paying for my technical expertise or for the humiliating retraction of a termination letter. He was paying for the air in Julian Price's lungs, a commodity that they had foolishly assumed came free with the building's lease. At exactly 4 minutes past the hour, a discreet notification window slid onto the desktop of my screen from my encrypted banking application, accompanied by a soft, understated chime that sounded absurdly polite given the gravity of the transaction. The text within the box carried the weight of a court verdict, confirming that $5 million had been cleared through the emergency escrow channel and deposited into my business account. I didn't smile, nor did I feel the urge to celebrate this financial victory. This wasn't a lottery win or a stroke of luck, but rather a cold, calculated exchange of value for survival. I closed the laptop with a deliberate snap, slipped it into my leather satchel, and stood up, leaving a $20 bill on the table for a $3 coffee a final. Silent tip to the universe before I walked back into the storm. Stepping out of the diner, the air hit me with the smell of wet asphalt and ozone, a sharp contrast to the sterile, recycled air that I knew was currently freezing the lungs of my former colleagues. The scene outside the facility had transformed from a quiet morning into a chaotic tableau of flashing lights and confused authority. With 3 fire trucks parked at odd, defensive angles near the loading bay, and a police perimeter establishing a nervous distance from the amber biohazard beacons pulsing rhythmically on the gray walls. I approached the yellow police tape with the calm, measured stride of someone who owns the pavement beneath their feet, ignoring the frantic shouting of the first responders who were struggling to interpret the building's automated warnings. A young officer, his raincoat slick with water and his face pale under the strobe lights, stepped forward with his hand raised in a command to halt. His voice strained over the wail of the sirens. He began to recite the standard warning about a potential biological containment event, but I didn't break my stride or raise my voice to match his volume. I simply looked him in the eye with the absolute certainty of an architect walking through a house they built, explaining that I was the independent containment consultant hired by the owners to remediate a false positive system error. Before he could argue or demand identification that I no longer officially possessed, O'Malley stepped out from the reinforced security booth near the main gate, looking like a lighthouse keeper in the middle of a hurricane. He was wearing his heavy winter parka, just as I had instructed, and his gravelly voice cut through the noise as he shouted to the officer that I was the only person capable of opening the doors without triggering a secondary lockdown. The tape was lifted, not because they understood the technicalities, but because in a moment of crisis, people instinctively make way for the one person who isn't panicking. Walking past the huddled firefighters who were anxiously checking their Geiger counters and gas meters, I bypassed the main glass entrance entirely, knowing that the magnetic seals on those doors were currently engaged with 5,000 pounds of force. Instead, I headed toward a nondescript metal panel embedded in the concrete perimeter wall, a feature disguised as a standard utility junction box that most employees had walked past for years without ever noticing. This was the redundant access point I had insisted on installing 4 years ago, a hard line into the facility's nervous system intended for use by fire marshals in the event of a catastrophic power failure or a total server collapse. It was the one part of the infrastructure that didn't rely on the cloud, the central server, or the missing master key that was currently frozen in Trent's pocket. It relied on legacy code, the bedrock of the building's logic. I reached into my bag and pulled out my old ID card, not the sleek active badge they had deactivated that morning, but my original, faded identification card from when the facility was first commissioned. Price had been thorough in scrubbing my current employment status from the HR database, effectively killing my daily access, but in his arrogance, he hadn't realized that architect-level permissions were hard-coded into the building's base firmware, tied to the physical RFID chip in this specific piece of plastic, rather than a user profile on a server. I pressed the faded card against the sensor plate hidden behind the panel, and for a long, breath-holding moment, nothing happened, except the sound of the rain drumming against the hood of my coat. Then, a heavy, mechanical clunk echoed from deep within the wall, vibrating through the concrete against my fingertips, followed by the amber light on the panel, turning a solid, unwavering green. A small, weather-protected keypad lit up, awaiting a command that hadn't been entered in years. I didn't type a standard PIN. I typed a root-level command sequence I had memorized a decade ago. A string of characters that bypassed the user interface entirely and spoke directly to the machine code. System reset initiated, a robotic voice announced from the panel, loud enough for O'Malley to hear over the rain. Disengaging asset preservation mode. Venting nitrogen. Restoring oxygen flow. The sound that followed was a physical sensation as much as an auditory one. The massive exhaust fans on the roof reversed direction, shifting from a high-pitched, suffocating whine to a deep, thrumming bass note as they began to violently suck the inert gas out of the building and pull fresh, rain-soaked air into the intake vents. The most dramatic visual confirmation came a few seconds later when the heavy steel blast shutters covering the executive windows began to rise. It was a slow, grinding ascent, the metal teeth of the gears protesting against the cold as they lifted the armor plating to reveal the carnage inside. As the shutter above Price's office cleared the glass, the reality of the situation became visible to everyone on the street. The window was frosted over from the inside, opaque with a thick, swirling layer of ice that made the office look less like a workspace and more like the display case of an industrial deep freezer. I walked toward the main entrance as the magnetic locks disengaged with a sharp, pneumatic hiss, releasing the vacuum seal that had held the building shut. The double doors slid open, and a wave of dense white fog rolled out onto the wet pavement, swirling around my ankles like dry ice at a concert, carrying with it the biting chill of the interior. I stepped into the lobby, the temperature drop hitting me instantly. It was freezing inside, easily 20 degrees below zero, and the reception desk was covered in a fine, sparkling layer of frost. The potted plants in the lobby were frozen solid, their leaves brittle and brown, shattered on the floor where they had drooped under the weight of the flash freeze. I didn't run up the stairs to play the hero. I waited by the security desk, watching the monitors as a team of firefighters rushed past me, heading up to the second floor with oxygen masks and thermal blankets. O'Malley, who had remained at his post, silently handed me a thermal cup of tea, his face grim as he watched the camera feed from the hallway. He didn't offer congratulations or make a joke about the weather. He simply nodded, acknowledging that the transaction was complete. "They're alive," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the screen where the rescue team was breaching the executive suite. "But they aren't going to be happy." I took a sip of the tea, letting the warmth spread through my chest, and replied that happiness was never a deliverable in the contract's survival, was the only metric that mattered. 10 minutes later, the paramedics brought them down. Trent came first, the arrogant young man who had treated my safety protocols with such disdain, now wrapped in 3 silver thermal blankets, shivering so violently that his teeth were creating an audible rhythm. He looked terrified, his eyes wide and unfocused, the digital innovation he preached about having failed to keep him warm when the analog world bit back. Then came Price. The chief financial officer was being supported by 2 firefighters, his legs dragging slightly as they guided him across the frozen lobby floor. His expensive Italian suit was ruined, stiff with frost and moisture, and his lips were a shade of cyanotic blue that stood out starkly against his pale skin. He was conscious, but barely, his cognitive functions likely slowed to a crawl by the hypoxia and the hypothermia. As they guided him toward the waiting ambulance, he lifted his head, his eyes scanning the lobby with a glassy, confused desperation, until they landed on me. I was standing near the door, dry, warm, and holding the very thing he had tried to discard control. He stopped moving, planting his feet with a stubbornness born of shock, staring at me with a mixture of hatred and profound, shaking realization. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to fire me again, perhaps to threaten legal action, but his jaw was too stiff to articulate the words, and all that emerged was a raspy, frozen wheeze. I stepped forward, closing the distance just enough so that he could hear me clearly over the chaos. "The invoice has been paid, Mr. Price," I said, my voice calm, professional, and devoid of malice. "The system is reset. You can have your office back now. Though I would recommend letting it thaw before you attempt to sit in your chair." He slumped, the fight leaving him as the cold took over again, and the paramedics hurried him out into the rain, closing the ambulance doors on his tenure. The aftermath was swift and brutal. By the next morning, the story wasn't just a local curiosity. It had become a case study in corporate negligence, whispered about in boardrooms across the city. The narrative was simple and damning. A tech-obsessed executive had removed a critical safety redundancy to save costs, and had nearly killed himself and his staff in the process. The biologistics freeze became a trending topic in industry circles, not because of the drama, but because of the sheer stupidity of ignoring the physical reality of the infrastructure. I didn't have to leak the story or contact the press. The police report and the fire department's incident log were public records, and the entry for the cause of the lockdown was listed simply and indisputably as unauthorized removal of safety director caused automated defensive protocol. 2 days later, my phone rang again, and the caller ID displayed the private number of the chairman of the board. He was a man I had met only twice in 8 years, a distant figurehead who usually only communicated through quarterly memos, but today his voice was tired and stripped of corporate pretense. "Kalen," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "Price is gone. The board voted this morning. Gross negligence, reckless endangerment, and a dozen other violations. He'll be lucky if he doesn't face criminal charges for the nitrogen exposure to the staff." I listened, sitting in the warm comfort of my home office, watching the rain hit the window, feeling a sense of closure but no joy. "We want you back," the chairman continued, his tone shifting to one of negotiation. "Full reinstatement. A 20% raise. A formalized contract guaranteeing that no one can override your authority on safety matters again. We need you to stabilize the ship." I let the offer hang in the air for a moment, tasting the vindication. It was a good offer, the kind of apology that comes with a corner office and a title bump, but as I looked at the business plan I had started sketching out on a napkin in the diner, I realized that I couldn't go back. You cannot fix a broken culture by simply patching the software or rehiring the scapegoat. The trust had been fractured beyond repair. "I appreciate the offer, sir," I said, my voice steady. "But I won't be returning as an employee." The insurance carriers are undoubtedly demanding a certified safety director be on site before they renew your policy, and I can help you with that, but not as a subordinate. I paused, leaning back in my chair, feeling the shift in power dynamics. I've started my own firm, Kalen Risk Solutions. My first proposal is already in your inbox. It outlines a comprehensive external monitoring service. I will personally oversee the safety protocols of your facility, but I will do it as an outside vendor. That way, the next time a CFO decides to cut costs, he can't fire me. He can only cancel the contract, and the contract has a punitive 6-month cancellation penalty. The chairman chuckled, a dry, resigned sound that acknowledged his defeat. You really have us over a barrel, don't you? He asked. No, sir, I replied. I'm just ensuring that the barrel doesn't freeze. He signed the deal that afternoon, electronically, without a single revision. 6 months have passed since the freeze, and the facility runs smoothly now, quieter and more efficient than before. Price has moved on, surfacing briefly at a cryptocurrency startup before fading into obscurity. While Trent was quietly demoted to a junior data entry role, far away from any physical hardware or safety-critical systems. As for the building, there have been changes. If you walk into the executive office today, the one with the glass walls that are no longer frosted, you will see a new addition to the modern decor. On a pedestal in the center of the room, encased in a thick block of tamper-proof acrylic, sits a heavy, battered titanium key fob. It isn't plugged in, and it isn't active. It acts as a monument to the past. Below it, a small brass plaque reads, "The cost of safety is always less than the cost of silence." I visit the site once a week for inspections, walking the catwalks, checking the pressure valves, and listening to the hum of the compressors. And when I leave, I always pause at the main panel to see the green light glowing steady and true. A reminder that in a world obsessed with disruption, speed, and efficiency, there are some things you simply cannot hack. You cannot disrupt physics. You cannot optimize survival. And you should never, ever, fire the person who holds the keys to the cold. I pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped out into the Seattle rain, the air cool against my skin, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel cold, it just felt like business. Silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes, it is the most calculated strategy you can deploy. They mistook my quiet exit for weakness, forgetting that the architect always knows exactly where the load-bearing walls are. Real power isn't about shouting to be heard. It's about knowing exactly what happens when you finally stop holding everything up. If you have ever had to quietly pack your box and let the system prove your worth, know that you are not alone. If this story spoke to you, please like, comment, and share it with someone who is still finding the courage to know their value.